Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of SURF's Partners in Place annual conference. I'm Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF, Scotland's Regeneration Forum, and as you will probably have heard, today's session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be seen, you can turn your video off. You can also change your name to something anonymous if you wish. As I said, today is day 2. Yesterday, unfortunately, the Minister was ill yesterday, so we didn't hear directly from Tom Arthur. Ian Murray gave his speech in his place, but we heard what sort of the government's national policy direction was from a regeneration perspective, as well as some local impacts of COVID on Lark Hall, and really the impact of COVID in general, I suppose, across community development work and regeneration in Scotland, from Foundation Scotland. And it was an excellent session looking at national and local experiences. And today we are carrying on with the local and the wider national perspectives, because today we are learning from one of SURF's own projects in Dunoon, and we'll be having a look at what's been happening in Dunoon over the past couple of years and what the future also holds for Dunoon. And then we'll be having a wider look at place and some of the national organisations and how what they have learned through a Partners in Place project. So that's Corra, Inspiring Scotland, SCDC and SURF, that have an informal grouping, along with the National Lottery Community Fund. So you'll be hearing from those speakers as well. And then we have a half-hour session with funders, which is not why you're all here, just to hear about the money. But we will be hearing basically a pitch from the funders as to what their priorities are in the short term, and then maybe we'll have some discussion on maybe the long-term changes that we are all talking about, I suppose, in general across the sector that are needed, and about funding collaboration and so on. But you didn't come today to hear from me, and so what we're going to start to do is move straight on to our first session, and we're going to be hearing from Anne Campbell, who is our SURF facilitator in Dunoon, and Tom Warren from the Dunoon Communities Development Trust. So Anne, I will hand over to you if you would like to share your screen.
Thanks, Ewan. Here's hoping I can click on the right bits, but
looks successful.
Oh, back a bit. Hi there, hi everybody, and welcome to sunny Dunoon, which it actually is today. What I want to do is just give you a quick introduction to the town if you've not been here before, tell you a bit about how the Dunoon Area Alliance came about, and then talk a little bit about some of the approaches we've been taking to support an area-based approach to regeneration here. So, if you don't know us, Dunoon is a small coastal town on the Clyde coast, 8,000 population at the moment. It's the main town for the rural Cowal Peninsula, which has an additional 3,000 people living across it. It grew in the Victorian era from a very small village to a major holiday resort for the Clyde coast, and it attracted generations of tourists, particularly from the Central Belt and through its Dune the Water era of popularity. But then by the 1960s, like all UK seaside towns, it was facing a fairly shaky future with the rise of the affordable package holiday. But Dunoon had quite a different future ahead of it compared to other seaside towns, because in 1961, the United States Navy located its Site 1 Polaris nuclear submarine base in the Holy Loch, which is just about 3 miles from the town centre here in Dunoon. And that had a massive economic impact over a 30-year period, bringing enormous amounts of money into the community. It was quite unique in that the base, the personnel from the base lived within the community, and their children went to the local schools. So it had an enormous social impact as well. Then in 1992, with the end of the Cold War, the base was removed as quickly as it had arrived, and leaving Dunoon with facing a real economic black hole. Today's Dunoon is a low-income economy, heavily reliant on the service sector and seasonal jobs. We've got a predominantly elderly population, and our young people tend to leave the area as soon as they can for employment or to study. And those who don't leave face fairly limited prospects in terms of employment and housing within their own town. In 2017, as part of Surf's Alliance for Action programme, a town-wide charrette was organised, and it had central involvement from Argyll and Bute Council and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And this short, sharp consultation resulted in a very long list of potential regeneration projects. And these were subsequently shortlisted by a local steering group led by Tom, and that formed the action plan for Dunoon Area Alliance. Then the 2018 National Lottery Community Fund provided Surf with funding for a part-time facilitator post to support the delivery of the action plan, and that's me. So what have we been doing? Well, the reality on the ground within our area, as in many other areas, is very complex and very fragmented. Years of cuts and restructuring have left workers in all sectors overstretched, under-resourced, and often unable to consider anything beyond their immediate priorities. So our first most vital action was to help build connections, to help share information across all sectors and with our community. I quite often describe my job as being paid to be nosy and to help join the dots. We've been actively supporting community gatherings pre-COVID, moving away from the tendency to have organisations and agencies behind a table with leaflets. We turned it on its head and turned it into what we call the power of the kettle, bringing the community together and then inviting organisations to come and meet them and spend time with them. We've also been supporting a town team approach, trying to bring together any workers with a remit that has any connection with regeneration to help them to build relationships, strengthen their connections, and their understanding of the value of joint action. One of the priorities in the charrette was to consider how the American year's heritage could be recorded and shared for the benefit of the area. And we worked with local volunteers to establish a constituted group, which then applied for funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And their ambition to develop a local touring exhibition to work in schools morphed through lockdown and has turned into an international podcast series with a dedicated website. So I would encourage you to have a click and a listen. By supporting cross-sector discussions, we've established a couple of working groups on priority themes, and that's helped us to engage with national partners, like here with the Cycling UK, to support new initiatives in the area. So this Bike Bothy project then provided Argyll and Bute Council with the evidence of need for the use of a building that's been lying empty for decades. It's been partly restored, but it's basically just a very fancy shed with no interior. But they've now been able to attract Crown Estate funding, and that will now go into transforming this space into an active travel hub for the town. We've also found that by working together with council officers, we've been able to represent local voices as new initiatives are being developed and explored, and we've been able to lobby directly for local opportunities in the procurement of contracts for new pieces of work. Dunoon also, excuse me, has a business improvement district, and that has an events focus. So our direct work with local business sector has looked more specifically at the challenges for freelance workers and for micro enterprises trying to survive in a rural context. We've worked closely with a local researcher to support the testing of ideas and development of a peer-to-peer support network for micro enterprises. And then during the first lockdown, we connected with the wider business community and created a directory that would share information on who was able to trade and how to make contact with them. We also developed a microbikes programme of training and support that was delivered by local freelance workers. it's become apparent, particularly I think over the last year and a half, that national funding streams for capital work can quite often come to local authorities at very short notice and with short-term spending requirements, so quick spend requirements, and this can result in a patchwork of approaches to physical regeneration. So what we've been trying to support and encourage is discussion and consultation ahead of those pieces of money being received. So we're actively encouraging the preparation of sustainable design schemes that would be ready for any potential capital investment. So on that, that's enough from me. I'll now hand you over to Tom, and he can talk a little bit about the next steps that we're about to take. Thanks, Tom. I'll leave you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. And that's great scene setting and an introduction to our community in Dunoon. One of the developments from the charrette and then the Dunoon Area Alliance as a way of bringing all local partners and delivery groups together has been to, well, just during the course of the last year, to establish a community development trust, as that was a kind of organizational structure missing from the town. A lot of our neighboring coastal communities, the smaller villages that feed from Dunoon in terms of the services that are provided here, all have their own development trusts, but Dunoon was somewhat lacking in that. It's been quite a long, I wouldn't say slow process, but it's a long-term development. None of this change and positive regeneration is going to happen quickly. So getting the structure right took some time. So establishing a SCIO, of which I'm now one of the initial trustees. Later in the year, once we've really grown the membership, we'll be having an AGM and making that governance really open and clear and easy for, hopefully, for everyone to engage with. That's a real strong value of what we're trying to do. The region we're looking at for the future need to come from discussions as a community, and really important is that we're getting representation, particularly from some of the harder to reach parts of our community who, for very good reasons, don't have the time to be the active volunteers that tend to focus around these kind of projects. The sustainability of everything we're doing, both ecologically, but also socially and economically, so that there's capacity within another voluntary organisation, which Dunoon has many, is really important. And we're very shortly going to be looking for funding and resource to help put us on the right footing, so that we're getting good representation from the community and building on all of the good partnership works that's been done to date. I think Anne's outlined some of the long-term issues in Dunoon. I'm very optimistic that we've now got the model and the structure going forward, and with Anne's employed support through SURF, we're in a good place. But I think these things are going to be a long-term plan. The key is trying to get some of these quicker wins and different speed of projects, so that we can keep the interest. Not least, Dunoon unfortunately suffered a fire last week, so we've got another challenge within the town in terms of the streetscape and the loss of some of the heritage property there. So yeah, challenging but exciting times ahead. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tom and Anne, and a real microcosm of what community development work requires, but also important to hear that it's long term, it can be slow, and Anne, as much as you describe yourself as being paid to be nosy, the necessity of having somebody who is there doing the connecting between all the organisations, so that capacity and agency can, I suppose, be developed within a settlement. So thank you very much for that very brief insight into Dunoon. Obviously, if the weather is good, I'm being told that the west is best. It's sunny in Glasgow. It's the fog is lifting in Edinburgh, but we can all head over to Dunoon for a sunny day out and see what the good work of the Development Trust and so on has planned for Dunoon. So thank you very much. But now moving on to, I suppose, a sort of national perspective, but looking at how national organisations work locally. I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Derek Rankin, to talk about Partners in Place.
Thank you very much, Ewan, and hello everyone from a wonderful sunny day here in Govan, in SURF's office in Glasgow. So I'm Derek, I'm the policy manager here at SURF, and SURF is one of 5 organisations that's part of the place-based programme learning exchange group. So we're each here on the panel, we're going to tell you about our respective place programmes and briefly highlight the outcomes of a collaborative report we produced this year. I'll go first and I'll pass over to colleagues from the Corra Foundation, Inspiring Scotland, the Scottish Community Development Centre, and the National Lottery Community Fund. So once you've heard from each of us, we'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have about our programmes or about the report, and to discuss place-based working in the current context more generally. So SURF's Place programme is called the Alliance for Action. It's been running since 2013 with support from the Scottish Government and the National Lottery Community Fund. The purpose of the programme is really for SURF to roll up its sleeves and get directly involved in regeneration activity in a suite of economically challenged places in different parts of Scotland. We've heard from Anne and Tom about how it operates in Dunoon, and with the Alliance for Action, we're really trying to do 2 things. Firstly, we're looking to support practical regeneration outcomes based on community identified needs and demands. And secondly, we're looking to learn more about how regeneration policies are playing out on the ground in different types of places, from larger post-industrial urban areas like Govan here in Glasgow, or smaller rural towns like Langham down in Dumfries and Galloway. So as Anne and Tom highlighted, we use community charrettes and feasibility studies to identify a shared vision for participating places and to determine priority projects. We employ highly skilled local facilitators like Anne to work with community groups, with charities, with businesses, with local authorities, funders and national agencies in support of project delivery. And projects range from the physical, such as public realm works, the reuse of historic buildings, to economic interventions like shopfront improvement programmes and tourism development, and also social initiatives like ones that address social isolation and poverty and promote community and cultural participation. So we've recently completed an independent evaluation of the Alliance for Action. It found that in 2018 to 20, the last programme period, the programme was successful, meeting its twin aims of supporting practical regeneration outcomes, delivering improvements, while also providing useful feedback for policymakers and funders. So along with our partner organisations, we formed the place-based programme learning exchange group at the start of 2019. And the purpose is really to share developments from our respective programmes with each other. We also wanted to discuss the current landscape for policy and practice in place-based regeneration, and to explore potential collaborative work. So between us, we've got more than 30 active sites, including some of the most deprived communities in Scotland. And we're building up a really a good, useful bank of knowledge and experience that we're keen to share outside the group and use to influence thinking. So one of the channels for this learning is the Working Better Together in Place report. We shared that in the pre-conference materials, but I'll put a link in the chat box in a second. The report elaborates on what we see as the current challenges and opportunities for place-based work. It includes a set of case studies and collective learning outcomes. So one of the key learning outcomes is that our local experiences have emphasised just how essential cross-sector partnerships are to making a significant and lasting difference in a given place. We all agree that we need to see more meaningful long-term collaborations that focus on a place's wider challenges and opportunities, rather than single issue projects that make tokenistic consultations and talk about partnership working, but in reality, all the decisions are made by a single body and the wider community is not actively involved. So SURF contributed to the development of the place principle, which was adopted by the Scottish Government and COSLA. It's encouraging a more genuinely joined up and participative, collaborative approach to place-based regeneration based on the wider understanding of a place's needs. Our place work has also demonstrated the importance of regeneration connections and interactions that have working both horizontally and vertically within local systems and structures, and also the relationships across community, regional and national actors. So that's the SURF Alliance for Action programme. I'm now going to pass over to my fellow panellist, Gordon Mclean. Gordon is the National Coordinator of Getting Alongside Communities in the Corra Foundation.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Yep, so as Derek said, Gordon Mclean, Corra Foundation. So, and I'm the National Programme Manager for Getting Alongside Communities programme. So just to give some background to the programme, so also in 2013, that's when Corra, or Lloyd's TSP Foundation as we were then, wanted to do more than provide funding to communities, but to help support the resilience through providing ongoing support on the ground. We did data analysis, so with other funders, with the Improvement Service, identifying levels of inequality across Scotland and where funding wasn't reaching, etc. We had numerous conversations with local authorities, partners, community members to identify and agree the communities that we would work with. And the board so gave an initial 10-year commitment to each community. And so we're currently kind of a mixture of between 4 to 5 years down that line with each community. And our place-based approach is an integral part of Corra's new 10-year strategy. Just a bit of description about the programme. So the aim is to appreciate the distinctiveness of each local area, understand the aspirations of local people, and to provide support to help meet those so that communities can develop community influence and control, ensure assets and resources can be maintained into the future, and build social connections and networks. We are supporting 9 communities across 8 local authority areas, and you can see the list of them in the report. And we have a separate, dedicated and skilled community coordinator in each community, and it's their role to help create the conditions and connections for locally led actions to happen and for bold results to be achieved while working at the community's own pace. And ways that the coordinators do that are building relationships and trust with community and partners, being visible and accessible, facilitating and enabling capacity building, widening community participation, and seeking out voices that are seldom heard. So just as was described earlier, so we also aim to support sustainable long-term change in each place, and at a systemic level, without building ourselves into that system, so that we can make a planned and strong exit when the time's right. And also, it's important to stress that the ambition for each community that work alongside is set by the people in that place. We don't bring any preset outcomes with that. So, focusing on one of the other aspects within the report, so one of the aspects that we felt through our collective learning that works is having a strong community focus. So through working closely with communities in the way that I've described, what we've learned is that communities feel that the ability to be heard can vary depending on levels of their own confidence, who's listening to them, and existing mechanisms that exist, such as community planning. Due to coronavirus, some communities have found it harder to engage in decision making and know that it's happening, plus shorter timescales. Agenda-free space is essential, where people can simply come together and ideas can happen. Again, there's been challenges with coronavirus and with that. And also participation needs to be at the right level for each person. So whether that's simply coming along to a chair-based exercise programme and staying for a chat and a cuppa, through to designing community-led grant-making processes or leading on community action plans. Hopefully I've got a little bit of time left, so I'll just quickly give some examples of how having that community focus has supported positive outcomes. So as on top of the example that's in the report around Dunterley, we've found that the ownership and planning of local events and activities have increasingly been identified and led by community members, with a decreasing level of input from ourselves, that's both pre and post-COVID. So one example is Dumbarton West Community Action Group. So that just started a few local people wanting to organise local events with support from the coordinator, such as family day trips, summer activity day. Recently, they noticed a build-up of large waste items in their community due to COVID-19 restrictions preventing normal special uplift services from operating. and organised themselves an uplift amnesty through volunteers and approached the council to work in partnership to do that. They promoted that within the community and got a big response. They're also now very recently have constituted, and they're about to start working with the council and partners to develop a local community action plan for the area. And the community action group will be the lead in that process, which is great. Also, coordinators across some communities, so such as Fernhill and Blacklands, have support communities to lead on participatory budgeting, where communities have decided priorities and processes to meet local needs while developing confidence, skills and experience, while also being trusted to know what's needed in their own community and supporting local grassroots community groups and organisations. We've also, through pre-existing established food responses in areas that communities had helped establish, these were able to, such as in Langleys and Bunterley, to respond to coronavirus very quickly and help coordinate food provision and to support with partners. And then just to conclude, so what we've found and what we feel is communities possess a wide range of skills, experience and passion, and they know what's needed. We collectively need to ensure that community is at the heart of the discussion and decision making as we transition from the pandemic to the recovery. And we know, or there is an enabling policy landscape in Scotland, and through working in partnership while trusting communities and giving them the power and resources required, a lot can be achieved. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I now pass over to Andrew McGowan, who's the Link Up Programme Manager in Inspiring Scotland.
Thank you, Derek. Pleasure to be with everybody this morning. As Derek alluded to, I've looked after Inspiring Scotland's Link Up programme, which is a community-based programme that's been operational since 2012. You can read about it in the report and on our website, so I'm not going into too much detail, but I think it's worth emphasising that where we started with Link Up was an objective to build what we've come to call the fundamentals, person by person in the community, using social activities and participation. Those fundamentals for us were about supportive relationships, confidence and self-esteem, and building them person by person, not just with those activities, but by creating a kind of supportive environment. The success of that and our learning now, it's almost 10 years on, has shown us and proven that when that is achieved, what happens is the individual themselves is able to drive change forward for themselves and for their family. That manifests itself in terms of them maybe making deliberate decisions about improving in their own health and well-being. It can be about accessing education. It can be re-engaging with skills and qualifications, and re-engaging with employment. And another dimension to that as well is actually people accessing support where previously they've been very reluctant to do so, to go to their GP and ask for actually help. So that individual driven change has been a key success of our programme, a key learning point. But the individual change has also sparked a sense of belonging and a desire for collective action as well. And that collective action has seen it manifest itself in people taking on community assets, plugging service gaps, but largely looking out for and trying to improve the lives of everybody in their community, not just for themselves. So that's what Link Up's about. But what makes that happen, the magic that makes all of that actually bubble up, is the community development workers, and our local workers are key to that. And that's what I'd like to just spend the next few minutes just sharing some of our reflections on that. Why is that so important from a place-based perspective? Well, I would argue, and our learning would suggest this, that actually that type of work and the type of activities I've just talked about are critical in laying the foundations for all the other dimensions that place-based working can achieve. They're right at the grassroots level, and without them, sustainable change, I'd argue, isn't going to be possible. What have we learned? Well, I'm going to talk specifically about our Link Up piece, and I said that's 9 projects going from Saltcoats, all urban projects, from Saltcoats, Kilmarnock, Glasgow, Edinburgh, up to Kirkcaldy and up to Dundee. And there's 3 dimensions to this about what type of workers, the skilled and resource workers, community development workers you need. The first thing is you need workers with the right stuff. That's kind of self-evident, I would have said. But we've learned a little bit more than that. So most of our guys have come from a community development or a CLD type professional background. But what we studied and found out quite early on in the project was that they bring in intrinsic competencies and skills and values that are so critical to their performance in the role. We made them feel a little bit like lab rats, and we ran them through psychological diagnostic assessments in 2015, and they're going, oh my goodness. But this was really valuable because it informed our recruitment and support processes for those workers. 3 things stood out from that. There was a strong alignment in their personal purpose, values, and goals with what they do in their work. And that wasn't just about concern for the welfare of others. It was actually about wanting a better future. So there was a big driver for them. The second piece was there was a high degree of self-awareness. They were able to actually use their life experiences and the relationships they've had to inform the choices that they make in their day-to-day work as well. And as part of that was actually understand what's important in life. And the third dimension to it was the right personality. And yes, that's about caring and building trusting relationships with others. But what was really important in telling for us was a strong belief that the goals that they've set and that the community have set can be achieved, and a conviction that they can walk round through and over all those institutional and personal barriers that so often get in the way as well. So when you combine that intrinsic stuff with the core stuff, you've got some really powerful workers. But what we found was actually there's more needed. The type of people that we were working with tended to be some of the most marginalised. So supporting our workers and giving them training and skills to identify and support people struggling with trauma, people struggling with bereavement and loss, suicide, dementia has been a pivotal part of actually giving our workers more of the kit that they need to be effectively operating in the communities that they're supporting. So you can have all the right stuff, but actually you need to create a space for them to use that stuff properly as well. You can have it all, but if you don't give them the opportunity to use it properly, then it's not going to work. Important parts of that bit, and this was right from the outset, we said, look, you're going to have to take time and work at the pace of local people to understand and be interested in their lives. Now that came naturally because of those intrinsic things I talked about before, but giving them the space to do that became a critical part of their success. And at their best, those workers almost become pastoral in the role. And I think we know what that is. I'm not just talking that on a faith basis. You know, they're there to support people, and actually they're known by their names, not by the project, not Link Up. And I see that as a measure of success of Link Up itself. But secondly, you have to give the workers autonomy to flex and respond and adapt to that local context. About increasing the size of the box. You and I all know that when we are employed by somebody, we operate within a box. We've tried to push the boundaries of that box out and encourage them to adapt and respond. And I think just to underline that kind of space piece, what the ultimate lesson for us is let the workers be themselves. And that's when you start to get the combination of the right skills with that empowering space, really effective operational work. Thirdly, though, we have to sustain and support workers through this piece. Our learning is that part of the major success of the last 10 years is on 9 of our projects, 5 or 6 of the lead workers have been there from the very beginning. That's, for us, I think, an incredible achievement and a real measure of what's important for those communities. And one dimension to that, and it's so often overlooked, is pay. Pay is quite pivotal to this bit, and we've managed through our funding relationships and through our budgeting processes to make sure that all of our workers have got somewhere between a 1% and 3% pay rise every single year since we've been operational. And that's important. But there's other dimensions to it, about one-to-one support from my team, about having quarterly performance reviews to look at evaluation and learning and reflection on what's worked and what's not. What's worked, what the workers need as well. That's been a critical part of it. Bringing all of the workers together on a quarterly basis to explore and reflect again on what's worked and what not, and building a family relationship with each other. But what's been very transparent to us is that, you know, Link Up and the type of work that our guys are doing is emotionally, mentally, physically, even spiritually really draining. So those support mechanisms wrapping around has been important, but in the last 2.5 years, we've brought in psychotherapist support for our workers. And that's been primarily been about copability. So workers who maybe have gone through a strong period, a difficult period, can go to this Callum knows his name, he's been fantastic for us, but just getting that support and capability, and that sustains them within those roles. So I'm going to conclude now, just going back to my point is, if you can get all of that right, critically, what you're doing is you're sustaining and supporting workers to build, as I said, the foundations of which all the other dimensions of place-based working become so important around. But without those foundations, that sustainable change becomes so much harder to achieve.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So now we're going to David Allen, who's the Deputy Director of the Scottish Community Development Centre.
Thanks, Derek. Morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be along at the session this morning. I think I'm number 4 in what looks like a slightly disappointing comeback tour of a slightly aging boy band as well, but I just, maybe that's just me, you know. I'm really happy to be along to kind of contribute my stuff on in this in terms of our contribution to the place-based exchange and place-based working through our programmes. SCDC's the leading body for community development in Scotland, and I think over the past 8 or so years, we've been increasingly developing programme work around about supporting community-led place-based approaches, for want of a better word. I don't think we've called it that all through that period. I think the term place-based approaches, place principle, and so that has emerged more recently. But if you look back at what we've done through some of our programmes, such as supporting communities, then there's a real kind of connection there with what we've been doing in the past as well. I just want to kind of use my 5 minutes to talk a little bit about some of the things that we are doing to support place-based working, and give 1 or 2 examples of what that looks like in practice. I think our key programmes are particularly our Supporting Communities programme, which is funded through the Scottish Government Strengthening Communities programme, but we also developed working around developing support for community-led action planning and things like developing community involvement in the developing local place plans and so on. So building on Andrew's point previously about building some of that kit for people to use in terms of frameworks, tools, resources that can support that community lead and community ownership of place-based working and place-based approaches at local level. But also building on that, and one of the kind of key themes learning themes from the exchange was about a supportive policy landscape that helps to encourage and validate place-based working. And we're increasingly involved in helping people, I suppose, to take some of those opportunities that have been created by some of the supportive policy that's been developed over the past 5-6 years or so and is still developing. And I'll mention that a little bit more as I'm talking about our work in Supporting Communities programme. So some of the things that we've done in relation to supporting communities to take a leading role in the regeneration and development of their places is support for community-led action planning. And I think there's been a real development in community-led action planning across the country over the past few years, and that's been supported by a number of organisations. And we've done our best to help support that as well. Helped Argyll and Bute Council in developing the community action planning toolkit for them, which people have used not only in Argyll and Bute, but a lot wider as well. We've also more recently developed a toolkit on a kind of resource for the development of local place plans as well for Scottish Government. So hopefully those will be useful resources for people to take forward in their own, in terms of taking ownership of what happens in their own communities and their own places, and then being able to do something about that, which is probably the connection with our Supporting Communities programme, where we actually work and develop work in about 10 sites a year in terms of supporting local people to come together collaboratively in areas and sites to actually develop their own plans for place and their own initiatives and work. And we've done work with the other partners in the different sites, and thinking about Derek's and talking about Langham, been really pleased to working with SURF and developing support for Langham Alliance and what they're doing down there, as well as other partners in different parts of the country. And I think one of our kind of key aspects of that support is actually to help people take advantage of those opportunities that come up through the supportive legislation, if you like. So Community Empowerment Act is a major plank of that, whether it's community involvement in community planning, whether it's people putting in participation requests, whether it's about people taking on assets or developing their own resources or being more involved generally. It's about helping them to kind of understand what opportunities that legislation has for them and how they can take advantage of it. But there are other things as well, and I think the development of participatory budgeting, which I think Gordon mentioned previously as well. We're kind of key supporters of PB in Scotland and host PB Scotland network as well. So it's about making those connections across various strands of policy and supportive policy in Scotland. Just one or two examples just to illustrate that from our work in our Supporting Communities programme. I've been involved over the past 2 or 3 years in doing some work in Murray, supporting local involvement in community planning through the development of locality planning pilots. We're in the middle of a bit of a review of that early process just now, hopefully developing the learning from that will inform the community planning partnerships approach to community involvement in local planning processes, as well as continuing to build the capacity of those local groups to take forward their plans and to ensure local priorities are actually heard and acted upon and incorporated into the local delivery as well. And I was really interested to hear about the developments in Dunoon and the development of the Community Development Trust, because I think it's really important that we develop and support local structures, locally led, owned and governed local structures which can continue to take the lead in regenerating the local communities and actually without the need for organisations like us and Inspiring Scotland and so on to be prompting that all the time, and so that development and progress can be sustainable in the long term and not just for a kind of period of funding. So we aim to learn from the experience of all that work locally. A big plank of our Supporting Communities programme is to develop learning about what works and what gets in the way of good, solid, robust, locally led place-based processes and approaches, and we'll continue to do that as our programme develops. I don't think there's too much more I want to add on that. There's loads of information on our website, and I'll put the link in the chat once I've finished as well, with a direct link to our Supporting Communities page if anybody else is interested in that. I'll hand back to Derek as lead singer.
Thank you, David, and yeah, please do share links in the chat. So yeah. I'll pass over to the final member of our ageing boy band. It's Neil Rich, the programme director for Scotland of the National Lottery Community Fund.
Thanks, Derek. It's always good to finish with a Moby tribute act. Our contribution, connection to this report and our learning from this report derives mainly from our work on our Our Place programme, where we worked in 12 different communities to support community development work that led to investment of around £23 million. But it also draws on our work on community assets and on our more general approach over the last few years to try and shift our grant making to a more relational and place-focused way of working. And that work's taken an explicitly strengths-based approach, and lots of that draws on our Place experience, rather than working through a deficit model, which I kind of feel like some of that's making a bit of a comeback in the debate around COVID. And I think that the lessons that we learn here are really about the balance between those two things. Our work's been built on connections and relationships, and the fact that people who live in places are experts in those places. And like others, the Our Place initiative used locally based community development workers as well. And the key learning point from the report that I'm going to focus on is the importance from the beginning of being transparent about the challenges and conditions in a place. And I think there's some obvious and important lessons about why that matters, and not least of which is the fact that the truth is easier to remember. If work isn't based on an honest picture of a place, we're probably going to end up solving either the wrong problems or pursuing the wrong opportunities or losing local buy-in, because credibility and authenticity in that kind of work is crucial. But most important, I think, is the question of respect for communities, and that's really about respecting the knowledge, expertise and collective experience of local people. But in seeking to do that, I think there's a couple of things to bear in mind, a couple of subtleties that are sometimes forgotten. Conditions and challenges may not be entirely agreed on in communities. And also those communities are dynamic 3D pictures, and voices and experience in those communities are diverse. Questions of challenge are also driven by all sorts of personal, historical and cultural experiences. And those of us coming to a place, bringing our show into town, if you like, bring our own lens, freight it with our own bias and our own perspective. And I think we all need to try and be really aware of that. But that doesn't mean you can't get a broad consensus about our place. Well-facilitated exploration of collective knowledge is probably the most valuable thing we've got. And getting that on a par with what we have kind of seen as proper scientific data and proper strategic plans, I think has been a really important piece of that work. I think we're making progress. I also think there's more to do. Anyone who's been around community development work over the past 20 years or more knows this. But lots of this isn't really about learning something new. It's about remembering something that we already had the evidence for. And it's encapsulated best in something somebody said to me in Shortleys in Kilmarnock, one of the outplace areas. He said, it's a rough wee place, but it's a great wee place. Folk aren't daft. They know the pros and cons of the places they live in. We all do. And being clear about challenges doesn't preclude being clear about possibilities either. And I think that raises a real challenge to those of us who seek to take a strengths-based approach. It's no good being some kind of happy, clappy Pollyanna about things. You won't last, your credibility won't last 5 minutes. But that doesn't mean you can't look for strengths while also sharing an honest picture of the context of a place. And there's loads of tools and techniques that we've all probably used at different times that allow you to build up that messy picture. In the Outplace projects, we used open days, we used charrettes, we used visioning exercises. Some folk used the place standard model as well. But more importantly, we used things like parties rather than meetings, events, shop fronts, to build connections, build relationships, build trust, and build up that kind of layered panorama of what a place looks like. And there's always, as I said, a risk in that of raising possibilities while being, but also needing to be honest about what you can achieve. And I think that's really important for funders. You need to be really honest about what you've got in the bag. And the other part of that, I think, is trusting people with responsibility and resources. So in our place, we used community chests, for example, to allow folk to quickly make decisions about resources to solve small local problems. But we also trusted folk to spend quite a significant amount of money. And that is a powerful thing to do, to say, this is for the likes of you, I suppose. So essentially, as the lesson for me is, it's vital to build up a messy picture of a place and trust the tools and practice that enable voices to be heard, but also to be realistic, but also ambitious. And when I first started working in community work, folk were always saying, you'll get lost if you don't know where you're going. And my question was always, well, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know you're lost? But I'm pretty confident that if you don't know where you're starting from, you're already lost. And I think that's probably the key lesson coming out of this. And back to you, Derek.
Thank you very much, Neil. So I'm conscious we've gone over our time a little bit there, Ewan, but I'll hand back to you for hopefully still got time for some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. That was great to hear from all the panel, and some really interesting things coming out there. And I suppose the things that I'm taking from it are around preparation, structure, support, lots of invisible things. So not material changes, but things that are really highly necessary in the long-term ambition of changing a place or supporting a place to identify its own changes. And I also think, picking up on Neil's point at the end there, I think sometimes in leadership there can be a desire for neatness and a closure. And I think, as you've said, communities are dynamic, they're messy, it's a complex series of systems, and being able to sit comfortable with that is also really important. But we have a few minutes. Do we have any questions from anybody in the audience or that was on a panel for each other, for either for our panelists or for Anne and Tom from their presentation on Dunoon? You can raise your hand. I think many of you are maybe familiar with how to do that now. Or you can put a question in the chat box. Elaine, you are first up with your hand up.
Hi, it's Elaine Gibb from the William Grant Foundation. Just picking up on that point about communities are diverse, but they're also kind of a bit messy, which is, I think, a really good way to just describe things. Sometimes when we've looked at perhaps an area, and at the foundation we have a couple of geographies where we have a stronger focus for some of our funding strands, and we know those communities quite well, so we can we've got good local intel on the ground, but in other areas we don't. So I guess one of the challenges we sometimes face is communities don't always necessarily pull together, or those in community organisations don't necessarily always pull together, and that messiness sometimes can include potential duplication and challenges to that achieving the best outcome for communities. So I guess what would Dunoon and what would the Partners in Place partners kind of, I guess, recommend to someone coming new into a community and interested to find out, how they could best support it, but faced with a bit of a challenge around, well, actually, where do we start? Who do we talk to? And actually, I guess who's right and who's wrong? I don't know. Kind of a messy question.
Thank you very much, Elaine. A difficult question, and I'll put it straight to Anne, seeing as Anne, you started in Dunoon, so I suppose it was an issue that you were kind of faced with.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ewan. That's lovely. I think it's really difficult to know where to start, and I think this sort of advantage that I had coming into post was that I had been working with one of the key anchor organisations in the town for a period of time, and that job had required a great deal of engagement with the community across a whole variety of interests and issues. So I have sort of got off to a running start, really. But I think it's about trying to make yourself as connected as possible. I think the difficulty with these place-based approaches is often that we don't have any resource. So I'm one part-time person with no budget. So what I'm trying to do is persuade people to do something for nothing. So I think what would be particularly valuable is in those posts where those workers are in post to have access to some sort of seed funding, so that the projects that are coming up and those small quick wins that can engage people can actually be moved forward quite quickly without necessarily having to go through the longer process of finding a sort of suitable organisation to make a grant application to take things forward, which would then, then takes a further 6 months and into the process or whatever. So,
can I add, Dan, to answer one of your other points of the question, Elaine? I'm aware in other communities, there are multiple partners in terms of, in some cases, multiple development trusts even. Dunoon, I guess, has had that kind of deficit, which is why we've created the new development trust. That said, there are, and I alluded to in the presentation, there are a lot of voluntary organisations in the town and doing maybe more silo focused activities. And I guess one of the, building on the work that Anne's done with the town team and the alliance approach through SURF is to try and get everyone talking together, and the development trust to be, if it's not the lead organisation, at least providing some oversight and coordination, so that if people are applying for funding, we're joining up the dots, and we can, there's a kind of, because there is a danger of overlap. And as you say, if someone's got an idea, and we've got this, this is a live issue in Dunoon, there's a demand or a desire to improve some of the play facilities here. We've previously had a report commissioned to look at some of these, but then there's different groups looking at play equipment in different parts of the town, and it's trying to look at how, with limited resources, both in terms of people and funding opportunities, how we can bring the best impact and the most benefit to the community here. And I think without the development trust, there isn't there isn't that kind of, there's no one else here kind of, because you need people on the ground like Anne and some of the because that's all the world, I think. Sorry, you want to go?
Sorry, you'd frozen slightly.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, I'll leave it at that. That's fine.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, and after that. We have another question, a hand up from Callum Mclean.
Hi, thanks. Anne, it's a question for you, and I think Derek as well. I think you both said some really interesting things in your presentation, and I was particularly picked up on the point of providing opportunities for the young people to allow them to stay in the area and to create sustainable economic development. And that followed into what you were talking about, Derek, in terms of building capacity. And I particularly liked your concept of the strong exit strategy in terms of sustainability. I thought that was really quite poignant. What I really want to ask is are you measuring the impact of this? Because a lot of what we've talked about this morning has been about the voluntary sector, the community sector, about amenity in the area and improvements in the surroundings. But is there any measurement or data going beyond this into other sectors in terms of established businesses? Are they what's the benefit to them? Are they taking on new apprentices? Are they building skills and capacity for the young people to have a long-term career? Because my experience of the community sector is it tends to be a lot of the older generation who've got more time to commit to these sort of things. They tend not to be the younger generation who are trying to get on with training, having families and various other commitments that they might have, which don't, or maybe not conducive to getting involved in that kind of activity. And there's perhaps maybe an issue with sustainability when you're relying on the voluntary sector rather than building commercially sustainable businesses in the long term.
Yeah, I can pick up a little bit on that. I mean, I think we've been connecting with the developing the young workforce team in the town, and part of the work with the Co-works initiative that looked at freelancers and micro enterprises was about introducing developing the young workforce team to new opportunities that might sit with very invisible businesses in the area, ones that aren't, in workshop units or in shop fronts. So hopefully we'll be able to make some inroads there. I don't think we're big enough to be able to count yet the impact in terms of new jobs and such like. Within the Development Trust, we're trying to include junior members so that we engage with us. We're hoping to moving forward, engage with as many of the youth work practitioners in the area and support young people to feed their views and their needs up through the Development Trust to address those, and also in terms of working with local businesses, trying to support that. One of the initiatives that's picked up recently through the Charts organisation, which is the Argyll Heritage and Arts Regional Agency, is a Heritage Horizons project that's funded through Creative Scotland, and that's looking at supported placements in heritage organisations for young people aged 18 to 25, and that's just about to be launched on Monday. And they're currently actively recruiting young people to take on those opportunities. So that it supports a variety of different needs in the area. We've got a wealth of heritage and a whole series of heritage organisations, but largely run, like you're saying, Callum, by people who are retired and who are ageing within those organisations as volunteers and as leaders and committee members. So this is one small attempt and approach that's being tested, and I think the more that we can test those different approaches within our community, the better, and linking all of those things up with University of Highlands and Islands and looking at the training opportunities that are becoming available locally. And I think they've got a very strong basis in online learning. So they were, able to sort of hit the ground running through lockdown. And I think that has helped to raise their profile locally as an option for study rather than having to go away. But then a lot of our young people do actually want to just experience the world outside the small town, and we want to encourage them create a town that they want to then come back to as well. So I don't know if that helps in answering any of that, but
thanks, Anne. Do any of the panelists who followed have any response to that around engaging with young people, but also thinking about long-term sustainability, about future employment in places rather than encouraging people to get education and leave somewhere? Does anybody have an experience of that from?
Yeah, I suppose
Neil, thanks.
Our experience with community asset owners is that actually we've seen some quite significant economic benefit particularly in rural Scotland, actually, around development of assets, development of jobs. But lots of this stuff is really difficult, I think, to pin down in this line of work, partly because there's a huge risk of attribution, and partly because, well, we can do the work if we really want to, but we're going to have to divert a lot of resources from other things. We are working on it, certainly at the National Lottery Community Fund, to try and understand some of those more hard-edged economic impacts. Social impacts, I think, are harder, but I think there is plenty of emerging evidence that cohesive, confident, empowered communities do make a wider economic contribution as well, but just no very good at measuring it.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would agree that it is that some of the soft work that some of the partners are doing, it is very hard to claim credit for certain things, because actually it's not you doing it alone, it's a whole range of people that are contributing to it, so attribution is a challenge. There have been other very good questions in the question box, but we unfortunately have to move on. One is on the impact of the 20-minute neighbourhood policy for the Partners in Place project, what everyone thinks of that. That's maybe a discussion for another day. If you're not part of SURF's 20-minute neighbourhood practice network, please join it. We'll put a link in the chat for you there. And also there's been some other interesting exchanges in the chat box. If you don't have it open, it's worth looking at, around community right to buy, particularly over abandoned and vacant and derelict land, around if you have shop units that have no meaningful uses. The challenge, as always, is ownership. But moving on from the boy band, so let's say it's Sheep that's come back for a reprise from our lovely glamorous funders. So we're now going to hear from our funders, Corra Foundation, Creative Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland, National Lottery Heritage Fund Scotland, the Robertson Trust, and again, from the boy band, the National Lottery Community Fund Scotland, or MOBI, as he prefers to think of himself, maybe a bit cooler. And so I'd like to hand over to Elaine Wilson from the Corra Foundation to hear what their priorities are for the short term.
Hi there, thanks Ewan, and thank you for saying that we're all glamorous. That was a really nice intro. Just to say, my name's Elaine, as Ewan said, I'm Head of Learning Development at Corra Foundation. We're an independent charitable trust set up to really help support communities and people really to achieve their aspirations and opportunities. And we have a 10-year strategy which we launched just before lockdown last year. Emphasis on that is really working alongside people to help amplify their voice, use all the skills and experience, and help people to build their own skills and experience, and to collaborate more. And our collaborations include collaborations alongside people, communities, funders, governments, everything, really just to try and recognise that not one person can achieve all. We offer funding through our own funding routes, but we also deliver funding on behalf of other partners such as the Scottish Government, and we also deliver funding collaborations with other funders where funders have come together to develop a sort of shared funding aspiration. Currently, we have a number of funding strands open, which range from really small grassroots community funds for community groups to start to get reconnected and to start up. And that can be things like just allowing them to pay for rent for a community space for the next 6 months, whatever. So those kind of small grassroots things, through to our kind of core Henry Duncan programme, which focuses on a thematic area each year. This year it's mental health, and that offers potentially up to 5 years funding of unrestricted monies as well. And we also are doing have some funding alongside the Scottish Government, some new drugs funding for people who are affected by drug and alcohol issues. And again, that's a funding programme through the Scottish Government that's available for 5-year funding as well. We delivered a lot of responses last year in response to coronavirus. We administered well over 4,000 applications in a period of sort of 10 months, so it was really fast-paced. I think what we learned last year was the importance of trust and the importance of trying to streamline the information that funders often request that is unnecessary. And for us going forward, we're really keen to think about how do we ensure that we really listen to those points that people reflected back to us. So we continue to look at our application materials to make them accessible, supportive, streamlining the approaches we take. We also recognise that increasingly people have been talking about the need for more core funding and unrestricted funding, which would allow some of these community initiatives the space to plan and be flexible depending on their needs. So at Corra, we are kind of in the space of how we continue to ensure or support opportunities where we can, where possible, offer that unrestricted money, particularly for new programmes that we are progressing. Another area for us is the role of participatory or community-led grant making. So we're really keen and where we can, again, to really hear the voices of people from communities or people with shared or lived experience to really help inform both our grant making processes, but also to help make those decisions to ensure that it's meeting the needs of people and communities. Over the last year, we've delivered about 19 different community-led programmes, and we're planning to sort of look at how we increase and progress that over the coming year. And I think the other thing to say is, you know, at Corra, we're committed to working alongside other funders, as I've said. And that's not only just about how we can collaborate about funding, but how we can also work together on areas that have been identified as priorities from other organisations. So there is a group of funders currently exploring things like charity reserves and what that means and how you support more people. I know there's other work around capacity building needs. So there is kind of collaborations and conversations going on within the funder sector that can try and pull those things together. So to sum up, there is grant opportunities available on our website, and I'll put the link in the chat for people so you can see what best fits your needs. Prior to forward is thinking about how we adapt and listen to the needs of the people we're here to serve, focusing on unrestricted monies where possible and longer term multi-year funding, and that funders do collaborate. And I am now going to hand over to Karen from Creative Scotland.
Thanks, Elaine. As Elaine said, my name is Karen. I'm Karen Dick. I'm the Head of Place Partnerships and Communities at Creative Scotland. And I'm going to talk a little bit just about Creative Scotland's approach to funding, COVID, and what we've learned. So as many of you will know, Creative Scotland was, prior to March 2020, actually undergoing a lot of work around revising our funding. We had been undertaking a funding review, which involved us speaking to many hundreds of people across the country, both our applicants and stakeholders. It involved us looking at research on funding models, both in the UK and across the world, which noted to us that there are no right funding models and no models that easily translate from one nation to another. What we already knew prior to March 2020 was that most organisations and people want to be able to work with the benefit of sustained long-term investment. However, it is also still true that there is more requests for funding than there is money available to support people, and that we still have to support things that fit within our priorities. Over the last year and a half or so, in addition to providing 10 times the number of awards that we would usually provide, and with an additional £75 million at March 2021, which has increased over the last few months with some additional Scottish Government funding to support emergency COVID relief, we have been revising some of our funding programmes. We've just launched our new open fund for individuals with some tweaks and changes to the previous funds, including the addition of 3 separate tiers. So there's a smaller, quicker turnaround for under £5,000 than there used to be, which the that used to be between £1,000 to £15,000. So there's a slight change there. There's also a move to an online application system, which is how we delivered quite a lot of our emergency funds last year as well. And some changes around to make the funding more developmental, more supportive around what information we need and whether we ask for all information upfront for any grant when actually it might not be relevant for some applications. We will be moving on to look at how we support organisations next. One of that main focus on long-term revenue funding for organisations. At the moment, we fund people through a regularly funding programme, and through the Open Fund, we fund people year on year, but they have to apply every year. So as part of what we're doing, we are looking at how we can revise this, taking into account what we have learned over the last year, similar to, as Elaine pointed out, about only asking for the relevant information, streamlining processes where we can. This will include moving to online application processes, and also ensuring that the funding that we are delivering is more about a developmental approach and an individual relationship approach with applicants, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, which we more or less did before. So what we're looking to do is to have a broader base of organisations receiving funding regularly, strengthening relationships, improving our decision-making processes linked to our priorities. And we have just also launched our annual plan for 21-22, which has some revised priorities for our future, which include equalities, diversity and inclusion, and that is about a diverse range of people and organisations being supported across the communities of Scotland. Fair work, sustainable development, which is both about the climate crisis and about sustainable creative businesses, and international. So we're aiming for more simpler and more transparent processes, and for some specific projects or funding programmes that might relate to what we've been discussing earlier during this session and through previous sessions. Our Culture Collective programme, which is a COVID-19 emergency fund, kind of puts out a bit of a statement on how we would like to support communities and organisations who work within communities in the future. And that is focusing on ensuring that the support is there for creative people, which is of course Creative Scotland's priority, with a minimum of 50% of the application having to go towards fees for creative practitioners. Also ensuring that projects aren't developed for the community are engaged. Have to be developed with the community and with community organisations in order that they respond to community needs and the desires of the people there, rather than things being done to people. So just to sum up, for Creative Scotland, a little bit like other funders, we are planning to take the learning from last year, add it to the learning and research that we had been working on before that, and move to a more simpler, transparent way of working that will support people for what they need, rather than supporting and making applicants fit into our specific criteria, which we will still have, but we're hoping to be more flexible and it to be an easier process for everyone. So I'm going to hand over to Amy Eastwood, who's the Head of Grants at Historic Environment Scotland, for the next bit.
Thank you, Karen. So yes, I'm Amy Eastwood, Head of Grants at Historic Environment Scotland, which is the lead body for looking after and promoting Scotland's historic environment. So that's historic buildings, sites and monuments. At the moment, we're still focusing on supporting existing grantees as best we can, and delivering our core grant programs around things like historic building repair, engagement, and traditional skills training. But actually, we're undertaking a refresh of our grant programs, so quite a comprehensive one. And we do have a public consultation ongoing as we speak. So I thought it would make sense to focus on this bit. So our refresh is something that that has been in the pipeline for a while now, but it became more important definitely with the arrival of COVID-19 and its impacts. So we have been doing our best to take into consideration those impacts as we develop our proposals. And that's having learned about this through, like other funders, through the delivery of a recovery fund for the sector, which we're finishing up at the moment, and also from some surveys that we've undertaken with the sector last year. And so just to look really quickly at just a few of the key points that we're proposing. We're proposing to streamline our existing programs. So we have about 7 programs at the moment, and we're going to introduce an open program, which is going to have more frequent opportunities for people to apply, and also deadlines which are better aligned with those of other funders, and the funders that we work with most frequently, such as the Heritage Fund. Also shorter application timeframes, that sort of tiered system, so shorter application timeframes for smaller grants and lighter touch process. More flexibility around our eligible costs, especially when we're looking at the wider outcomes that the historic environment can deliver for society and the environment, looking at energy efficiency. Just another example is that we've had some feedback over the years that it's not always feasible to fundraise for that sort of large comprehensive project that we would traditionally fund. And so we're looking to introduce the possibility of funding for what we call interim repair projects. So that's a more flexible approach for things like emergency repairs for those at-risk heritage assets that are important to communities, which might fall through the cracks if they had to spend several years fundraising. So this is something we can do when a more sustainable plan is being put into place. Finally, we are developing a new area-based heritage regeneration program, which will replace our current conservation area regeneration scheme. And we feel that this is really important right now because historic environment can play an important role in supporting town centre renewal, and that's key in the context of a post-COVID environment. So we feel the historic environment can really help to attract and support new uses locally and provide that sort of vibrancy to help create sustainable places. So as part of this program, we're going to be looking to work more proactively with applicants in with a funded development phase. So that's a new thing for us, and we think it's going to lead to sort of stronger engagement with communities. And also more support for applicants from the experts that we have in-house at HES. So I think that's probably all I have time to say, but just to add here at the end, if you'd like to have a say in our consultation, there should be a link circulated, and that will be open until the 6th of September. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Caroline Clark from the National Lottery Heritage Fund.
Hi, thanks Amy. Sorry, just struggling with the mute button there. Somebody had to do it. I'm Caroline Clark. I'm the Scotland Director for the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So my role is to look at the strategy for distributing funds from the National Lottery to support heritage across Scotland, and not just the built environment, but also landscapes, environment, culture, buildings, maritime heritage, you name it. It's a very diverse interpretation, and one that I feel sits therefore well with the placemaking agenda we've been discussing today. Since we were set up in 1994, we've put in about £900 million into Scotland, around 5,000 projects across the country, and pretty much all of those have had some impact on place, regardless of whether they have been actually attributed to repairing a historic building or regeneration, or whether they're looking at the culture and history of a place. So that really is a core element of our funding. So I thought you know, as the Heritage Fund, it would just be worth touching on why we're here in this discussion. And this is something that's really come out for us over COVID, is how personal your place is, and how connected it is to who you are, where you've come from, your identity. And for Heritage, that the Heritage is woven very much into all of the projects that you're talking about and that we've supported over the years. So Derek, you mentioned earlier Govan, somewhere that we've invested in very heavily in terms of heritage-led regeneration, because it's culturally bound together by its shipbuilding past from Fairfield right back to the early Christian Govan stones. And for me, that heritage connection is a really powerful tool in helping to regenerate place and make sustainable change happen. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about our funding streams, but I just want to look back a few years to some of the particular place-based initiatives that we've supported in the past. Townscape Heritage Programme, many of you will be familiar with. It worked in partnership with the Historic Environment Scotland CARS programme really effectively. We have a rural equivalent, Landscape Partnership. That was also a programme. And then in around 2017, we launched a Great Place initiative as well. The links for some of these, Emma's popping into the chat. And in the current strategy, which we're now about halfway through, we got rid of all of these programmes and we created a more general fund. All of these things can be funded through the open programmes that we now have. So we are really keen to hear from any local authorities or other agencies who are interested in developing those partnership-led approaches that have been such a feature of the placemaking that we've been discussing so far today. To move on to COVID, so we did a huge turnaround in March last year, closed our project grant funding, and turned all of our cash resources into supporting the heritage organisations across the whole of Scotland. And over a few months of the summer, we gave out £6.4 million to 105 organisations across the country to keep them going. And I think it's interesting to reflect that the reason these organisations needed the money is not just because they care for buildings or museum collections or historic railways. We got a lot of historic railways in, but because they're actually an inherent part of the fabric of local communities. Dunoon Borough Halls was one of the recipients, and it played an incredibly important part in keeping the community going throughout some of the really challenging times of COVID. And we need to support these community anchors in helping communities rebuild and thrive after COVID. And we did that. I think all funders will probably share this experience of having to turn very quickly. And what made that work, looking back, I think it was the relationships that had been developed over many years, but also us having an inherent trust in all of the organisations that we'd funded to tell us what they needed, and we just needed to give them that money as quickly as we possibly could. And it felt very much like we were tearing up the rule book and moving out of our comfort zone, but in fact it was incredibly positive and something that we want to keep moving forwards in the way that we have relationships with organisations that we fund moving forwards. I'm sorry, I'm aware of my 3 minutes overspilling there. So I'll quickly touch on what we've done now. We've reopened our main grant funding programmes. We opened those in February this year, but we've tweaked to prioritise those heritage projects that support inclusion, well-being, economic development and skills development, and also continuing to build organisational capacity and resilience, because we recognise that it's going to take some time to a very long time to rebuild back and to rebuild capacity into the organisations that we're working with. On a more prosaic level, we are rolling out a much more accessible online application system that's been really heavily tested with users. And I also just wanted to touch on our funding. We have around £16 to £20 million a year to give out, and we split those into under £250,000 grants and over £250,000 up to £5 million awards. We take decisions on those bigger grants 4 times a year. Those larger grants have a up to 2 year development period where we can pay for the time and space for those community conversations that, again, so many of you have touched on as being absolutely crucial to developing good place working. And I think often our development funding is overlooked in the rush to get to the big capital project at the end of the day. But we have really felt the benefit of being able to work in partnership alongside applicants and to really get an understanding of what communities need through that period of time. We also have, as some of you who've had our funding will be aware, we have a bank of consultants from across the sector, all sorts of different areas, whether it's business planning or technical expertise, who are a bank of consultants that we can bring in, that we can cover the costs of, to come in and support the development of different aspects of projects. And one of the things we've changed post-COVID is that we're now bringing those in to support priority applicants before the bids have been put into our system. So if you're thinking of a project, or you know a community group from one of our priority audiences that are listed in our materials, but young people, for example, are in there, then we can also bring in specific expert consultancy to help them with their thinking and development before the application comes in through our expressions of interest process. So we're just trying to take as much of that learning and apply it as quickly as possible to the systems that we have in place. As I've said, we're halfway through a strategic plan period. We've got in the chat, Emma's put in the, I hope, the tweaks that we've put in for 2021 onwards, but we are also about to then embark on a much deeper consultation period with the rollout of a new strategy in a couple of years' time. And I will now hand over to Stuart McGregor at the Robertson Trust.
Thanks, Caroline. Delighted to be here. As a boy from Langham, delighted to hear Langham mentioned so much this morning. I'll try and keep it brief, give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the Trust. The Trust is one of the largest independent grant makers in Scotland. We're in our 60th year. We're reaching the end of the first year of a new 10-year strategy to improve the well-being of people affected by poverty and trauma in Scotland. And the strategy is the result of extensive consultation and listening to the needs of the sector. We wanted to make sure that our offer was right and reflects what the needs of the sectors are, and that consultation helped inform what our role should be as a funder. So some of the key things that came out from that were more unrestricted and longer term funding, less emphasis on match funding, particularly for smaller grassroots organisations, more capacity building for grant holders, and just continuing to be approachable and flexible as a funder. So we wanted our offer to reflect those needs, and we're committed to funding charitable organisations that support people and communities who are living with poverty or trauma. Under this overarching kind of poverty and trauma frame, we identified three key themes under which we currently fund projects or services through our open funds. So these include financial well-being, that will support work that aims to reduce or mitigate the impact of material poverty or the financial root of poverty. Emotional well-being in relationships, responding to our understanding that people's life experiences are affected by their physical, social and economic environments. We want to try and combat this by providing earlier help for those at risk of poverty and trauma. Educational and work pathways is a key area to support work that helps people to engage, maintain and progress through education into work and sustain that pathway. So our open funds are open to constituted groups and registered charities. That's a shift from previously. We had a smaller micro fund pilot that has now come into realisation as We Grants, and We Grants is for constituted groups or charities with an income of less than £25,000 per year. We then have our kind of larger funding offers through small grants for charities with an annual income of more than £25,000 per annum, up to a maximum of £100,000 per annum. And large grants is for charities with an annual income of more than £100,000, up to a maximum of £2 million. So it's through these three distinct revenue funding offers that we're trying to be a little bit more proportionate with the level of funding that we offer relative to the size of the organisation. So we make awards of up to £2,000 for 1 year through We Grants, but then on the other end of the scale up to a maximum of £50,000 per annum for up to 5 years through large grants, depending on that eligibility. So as I mentioned, we launched our strategy during a worldwide pandemic, which has been really challenging, but we've taken some significant learning from that, and we've realised that our independence as a funder is so important to remaining agile to need. We provided more than £1 million of purely unrestricted funding to our grant holders whose awards were coming to an end and that weren't able to reapply to us. We also want to continue to improve our offer for the wider sector and remain ambitious as we start to emerge from the COVID pandemic. So we launched Partners in Change quite recently over the summer. It's a new £2.5 million fund for organisations working in Scotland with an annual income of more than £2 million. But it includes organisations, not only charities, but housing associations, community interest companies, universities and credit unions. And this new fund has that widened eligibility to try and generate kind of fresh, deeper perspectives and get behind ambitious approaches, which will try and prevent or mitigate the negative impacts of poverty and trauma on society. We also wanted to work more collaboratively with other funders, and one of the ways that we're starting to do this, where it was mentioned around capacity building, was running a survey on capacity building right across the third sector, the responses of which will be used to inform not only our role, but probably other funders' roles in supporting the capacity, skills and capability of grant holders and the wider third sector in Scotland over the next 3 years. But as expected, demand for our funding since launch has been really high, and we'll anticipate this being even higher over the next few months. But we've been particularly struck about how many applications we've received that have been in areas that have really strong alignment to our broader strategic objectives, which, while it's really positive, it does mean that we need to consider kind of some refinements around the focus of our funds over the next few months. But we're committed to that not being to the detriment of our appetite to do things differently, to remain transparent and ambitious about how we support organisations that work with people in communities who are living with poverty and trauma. We know that we're not necessarily experts, but we want to continue to be informed by the needs of our grant holders and also the wider third sector. That's probably my time, so we'll go back to the broom cupboard with Neil, Director of Scotland for National Lottery Community Fund.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm like a young Philip Schofield. So the National Lottery Community Fund, you could kind of just take what Caroline said, take heritage out and put community in, and you kind of got it. The National Lottery Community Fund distributes national lottery funding for health, education, environment and general charitable purposes. The clue, therefore, is in the name. We believe that when people in communities take the lead, they make the biggest difference to their communities. So in Scotland, we distribute somewhere around £50 million of national lottery funds every year, plus other funds that we distribute from dormant bank accounts and on behalf of the Scottish Government. So we have the great privilege, along with Highlands and Islands Enterprise, to live in the Scottish Land Fund, which I'm sure a good few of you are familiar with. We've been trying to review our funding portfolio for a wee while, but stuff keeps happening. So we were about to embark on a kind of long conversation with stakeholders and customers and communities around our portfolio when the pandemic hit, and we literally, I'd gathered all the staff in to talk about all our plans and all the work, all the exciting stuff we were going to do, and then we all got a text the next day saying, "Don't be coming into the office again." So we've put that off, and that's given us a chance actually to adapt our portfolio a wee bit to the current circumstance, and we think that's been useful based on discussions with stakeholders. So at the moment, our funding is a wee bit shorter at 3 years as a maximum grant length, a wee bit smaller at a maximum of up to £200,000 in terms of grant size, but it's also a bit quicker, a bit simpler, and we've retained a lot of flexibility. And one of the things I'm most proud of over the past year in our work is the way in which we were able to flex and support our grant holders during the pandemic. So within the first couple of weeks of lockdown, we had spoken to everybody who held a grant over £10,000 from us, figured out what they needed to do, and essentially said to folk, do what you need to do and we'll sort out the paperwork later. I'm not quite sure if that's the audit line, but that's definitely what we did, and it was incredibly useful and a powerful lesson, or a reminder of a thing we knew, which is that folk are really sensible and they know what to do in their communities and generally behave pretty properly around funding all of the time. We have adapted our portfolio 2 or 3 times as we've gone along in terms of its focus. So we've also broadened our offer a little by offering to fund things like advice and supporting people directly who are dealing with financial hardship. because in our conversations with stakeholders and people who funded, that appeared to be a place we anticipated significant growing need. Some of that isn't flowing as quickly as we expected for lots of reasons. We diverted a good deal of effort into distributing funding on behalf of the Scottish Government as well, so we distributed around £10 million worth of community recoveries and funding as well. Going forward, I suppose a couple of things to say about our priorities. One of the things is we want to learn some lessons about how we work as well as what we do. So we now have a staff team that's more dispersed around Scotland than it's ever been, which is a thing I'm delighted about. And we do want to make sure that we keep some of the good lessons and approaches we've developed during the pandemic. So if you're based in the Highlands and Islands, that might mean you don't have to travel for 6 hours to have a 2-hour meeting with us. And we'll try and make better use of tech and think about how we engage more effectively. The other thing to say is a number of our other programs remain open, so Awards for All remains open. All this stuff's on the website, and it'll be better explained there than you're going to get from me. But one immediate priority for us, well, it's a plug actually, is that we across the UK want to support communities who may be inspired to take positive climate action by COP26, or more especially the noise around COP26. So we're opening a scheme called Together for Our Planet next week. And I forgot to send you the link to that one, Emma, so I'll pop it in the chat when I'm done talking. And that will, it'll be interesting to see where we go with that. Those are grants for up to £10,000 that essentially are about community action, either to engage in thinking and planning and understanding around climate action, or to take action around climate mitigation. So in the next year to 18 months, we do expect to be working with partners and stakeholders to consider what our longer term funding offer looks like, both what we fund and how we do that. We're currently, I'm kind of scared of planning it, because every time we make a plan for it, something awful happens. But so we'll try and keep the plan as quiet as possible until we can announce it safely. But we will be looking to work with folk to kind of set our course again around where can we make the best use of the funds raised by the National Lottery to support communities across Scotland. And I look forward to lots of really interesting conversations, possibly even in 3 dimensions with folk on that in the future. But I think I'm handing back to you now, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil. We don't have time for questions, and I suppose some of the questions that we may have been discussing with you, you've answered. But yesterday, for those of you who weren't present yesterday, we had a poll which asked, how confident are you that lessons learned in the last 18 months will be taken forward by funders? 70% said they were mainly optimistic, and I would say on the basis of what we've heard this morning, they have good reason to be optimistic, that you've all picked up on the things that funding for revenue, for core work is necessary. The trust that you have shown over the past 18 months in grant recipients, that sort of thing continues. And it's really positive and great to hear that coming forth from all of you, and the recognition that providing funding for the needs of communities rather than meeting your own needs while having your own criteria, it's a difficult balance. I sympathise, but it's really positive to hear that from all of you. And obviously we put links in there and people will be able to follow up with them. So thank you very much for the time that you've spent with us. And I suppose, to me, some of the messaging that you've said, we need to make sure that that messaging around where money is directly needed and the support that some of you provide leading up to capital grants, making sure that we share that messaging with our friends at Scottish Government so that they also realise that some of the apparently invisible work that our community facilitators and development workers do is a really necessary part of leading to physical regeneration in places as well. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Emma for a brief pitch for what's next for SURF.
Thanks, Ewan. I know that I am the only person now that stands between you and your lunch, so I will be brief with the adverts. I'll just quickly share my screen from the beginning. Showing. So just a quick pitch for this year's SURF Awards. We deliver these each year in partnership with the Scottish Government. They opened on the 3rd of June and they close a week on Monday at 5 PM on Monday the 6th of September. You can see our logo this year is a bear. It's about the feeling of hibernation and the world coming out of hibernation, much like a bear does. So as a bit of an incentive for applicants this year, winners will be getting a cuddly teddy bear, so that I know applications will now flood in. The 5 categories are community-led regeneration, supporting youth employability, which we've talked a wee bit about today, Scotland's most improved place, housing and regeneration, and creative regeneration. So if you want to apply or you've got any questions, you can email me, and all the materials are on the SURF website, and I'll stick a link in the chat. We are hopeful that we will be back in the room this year for the awards dinner on the 9th of December, back in the Grand Central Hotel in Glasgow. But more details will come on that. So just quickly, a wee bit about SURF membership. If you're not already a member, it's £50 for organisations and £20 for community groups and individuals. It's a free way to promote your organisation and activities to our network. You get involved with policy consultations like our manifesto that launched earlier this year, and you get advance notice on SURF events and activities, and a pre-booking period for things that might book up quite quickly, like today's event. So there's some information on the website at Join SURF, but I will send something round after the event along with a recording of today's event. There is one more conference session to come tomorrow, which is on climate change, which again we've talked about today. So if you haven't booked onto that and you're interested, there's some information on the SURF website in our events section. And just lastly, before you go, I did send around an evaluation form for today's event. If you could quickly fill that out for me and email it back to emma@surf.scot, that would be much obliged. And thank you. And I'll just hand back to Ewan now.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much again to Anne, Tom, Gordon, Andrew, David, Derek, Elaine, Neil, Karen, Amy, Caroline, Stuart, and again Neil for performing twice, and to you, the audience, for joining us this morning. It's been great to have you all here. Hopefully we'll be in physical space sometime, and we'll also make sure that we have more time for discussion. I think in the future, it's always hard online to tell how much discussion you're going to have, and today there's been questions, but there's also the advantage of the chat at the side, which will be captured, and the recording will be probably made available later today. Thank you very much. Enjoy the sunshine if it has reached you, as it appears to be reaching me here in Edinburgh now. See you later.